Trashy, exploitative, objectifying, fetish, cliche, self-indulgent, generic. All words that are forever tied to negative connotations, especially when we talk about anime. There's just far too many very insensitive, very exploitative, very indulgent series out there. I'm not saying it's a good or bad thing, it's just the truth. Though that is also kind of the point. Anime is one of the few forms of media that can be as unapologetic about its self-indulgence as it wants to be. And personal moral compass aside, it is impressive that stuff that would usually be shamed into oblivion in other fandoms is able to have a clear lineage in the otaku sphere. Is otaku sphere a word? I don't know, I'll just keep using it, okay? Now, there is and always will be debate when we talk about what we should consider exploitative and self-indulgent. It happens every other season when an isekai has a rape scene somewhere. Why include it? Does it serve the story? Is it indulgent? Gratuitous? Is the fact that it is any of those things a flaw? Well, here's something to think about. Is the fact that those trashy tropes and cliches exist inherently bad? You know, like, are the balloon-sized tits of that one girl in prison school inherently bad? Or is the way in which those cliches are used what determines whether it is exploitative and unnecessary? More importantly, what about you, the person consuming these stories? How exactly should you evaluate something that is self-indulgent? The answer is that you shouldn't care, but that can be hard to do when you want to talk about this stuff in public. How do you maneuver around the things that might not be for everyone? All interesting questions, and probably something you wouldn't be able to answer until you consumed a series that somehow managed to have real trashy, crass, and indulgent cliches and fetishes while also somehow keeping the gratification and exploitation to a minimum. Well, you're in luck. Yeah, okay, enough of the build-up, okay? Lazy Dungeon Master manages to do that pretty well, yeah? The whole spiel I just gave you, I just did it so I could talk about this series. So let's get to it. So while Lazy Dungeon Master seems like your typical isekai riddled with fanservice and predictable cliches, it actually takes the biggest, most self-indulgent, and kind of niche cliches and tropes floating around the otaku sphere and somehow manages to make them less indulgent than they should be. Okay, quick summary. Lazy Dungeon Master is a light novel about a dude with a foot fetish that loves sleeping getting transported to another world in which he meets a dungeon in the form of a cute anime girl. 2 slaves, 1 hotel, and a couple monster girls later, we see him catapult into plenty of adventures. We watch him consistently grow the dungeon, fight other dungeons, fight heroes, fight villains, meet people, meet dragons, meet demons, gain powers, etc. I didn't know how to approach this light novel because it's basically a whole lot of fetishes and generic fanservice cliches packed into an isekai. And with cancel culture nowadays. No, I'm joking. But it is true, more brazenly indulgent stuff doesn't land as well nowadays. It gets more harshly critiqued, and anybody who takes a look at the art for the series would think it is just your typical isekai, riddled with fanservice and insensitive scenarios. But I'm here to clarify that, yeah, that's kind of correct, at least at the start. I mean, in the first volume, our protagonist Keima observes a group of bandits repeatedly rape a slave inside his dungeon, and he does nothing about it except for commenting that it made him feel kind of uncomfortable. He then decides to save a lolly slave girl, and uses her as a body pillow, which is questionable. But then her first night as a body pillow, she pees herself because she couldn't move to go to the bathroom. This is all just the first volume, which is bad. The balance scenes come off as mean-spirited, and the protagonist not doing anything borders on frustrating. So I think you can understand why I had no idea how to talk about this series. The barrier for entry is high, by which I mean getting past a first volume as annoying as this one would be hard to do. Why then am I talking about it? Why am I subjecting myself to potentially being barraged with raised eyebrows? Well, because the series only gets progressively better after that disaster of the first volume. It's probably the most fun I've had reading a light novel in a while, and you might not believe me, but all the trashy, insensitive, self-indulgent stuff is part of what makes it good. But more of that in a bit. You hear the word dungeon isekai and you immediately think typical isekai action and broken powers, and it does lean in that direction for a bit, but it then proceeds to quickly spiral into the other, basically spinning a roulette for every volume. Spinning it multiple times, mind you. Once for the plot, once for the mechanics introduced, and once for how Keima is gonna find a weird way to use those mechanics to swiftly solve his problems. Timeline goes as follows. Keima builds a hotel next to the dungeon because he wants a room to sleep in, and the hotel attracts people to the dungeon. The dungeon business booms, so hotel business booms, so a town forms around the hotel. The town business booms, so Keima decides to come up with a religion, Buddhism, the mantra being sleep is number 1. Religion business booms, so tourism booms. Tourism booms, so dungeon, town, and hotel boom. And Keima is now a dungeon master, business owner, town chief, and a pope. And so every volume has Keima solving problems between any of these different ventures as quickly and cleverly as possible. An apt metaphor would be Keima doing a speedrun through whatever adventure he had that volume. There's a goal and a clear outline we should follow, but instead of doing that, Keima chooses to glitch through walls and skip important plot beats because they take too long. But enough of the good aspect, let's get back to the fan service, because yeah, there is just a whole lot of very trashy, for lack of a better word, fetishes and cliches thrown in here. The protagonist has a foot fetish, there are lollies, and the girls that aren't all have huge boobs. There are shotas, there are monster girls, there are succubus, there are gender-changing potions, there are tentacles, there are femboys, there are old dudes with mommy kinks. Some characters even mention Guro and Riona in a scene or two. There are slaves, and Keima even buys one with little to no remorse or hesitation. How on earth is any of this supposed to be anything other than indulgent fan service? All this stuff gives the impression the series is just senselessly throwing in fan service and gore for reader gratification. But, and bear with me here, all of these things are part of what make the series great. Except the slaves, of course. Mostly because despite a whole lot of very questionable stuff constantly being introduced, the series remains pretty inoffensive, which is impressive. You have all this stuff that should be considered off-putting, but the way it's used makes it less off-putting than it should be. The first 3 volumes are the roughest because they have the most scenes regarding slave and slave abuse, but don't worry, Keima gives the guy abusing a slave some payback by trapping him inside a wall unable to move for all eternity. And the slave stuff gets dropped completely after this, which is volume 3. After that, the series utilizes all the other questionable stuff as a way to tell jokes or come up with amusing scenarios. Meaning, it doesn't include it to be gratifying or shocking, it's using it to set up situations that are ridiculous and as a result also pretty funny. For example, Keima unlocks the power to become a cross-dressing femboy succubus queen and he infiltrates a crime ring with that power. But things go bad pretty fast because everybody in the crime ring has very specific fetishes, from simple stuff like incest roleplay to things like sniffing belly buttons. Later on, Keima magically gets a magically already grown-up daughter. She also has a foot fetish, but she takes it a step further because she literally eats dirty socks in order to get her nutrients. She also goes on to build a used sock museum. Near the beginning, Keima goes to buy a slave. He finds one that loves to eat at a suspiciously low price. It turns out someone bought her, but when she was told to eat the dude's member, she took it literally and tried to take a big old bite. Keima visits a country in which polygamy is the norm. Some guy tells him everybody in his hometown is married to one another, because if everybody's married and you don't gotta pay for babysitters and you can split the bills more ways. Alright, one more, and this one lasts for multiple volumes. After saving the lolly slave, Keima asks her what her name is and she says Niku, which means meat in Japanese. He then proceeds to introduce her as Niku pretty much everywhere and always gets stares of absolute disgust when he does so. Turns out, Niku means sex slave. So pretty much everybody thinks he's a gross pedophile for a huge part of the series. So the execution is straightforward and might not seem impressive, but it's a pretty clever way to disarm usually very gratifying fetishes. Keima becomes a cross-dressing fanboy succubus, but the punchline is everyone is too much of a freak, so you're immediately like, alright, I don't know about these old guys calling him mommy. Keima gets a daughter that shares his fetish, but it's hard to say it's a bad thing when she literally eats the socks. Keima buys a slave, but all the sexual innuendo is removed because she literally took a bite out of a dick once. Keima goes to a country where polygamy is the norm, but we quickly find out there's no real kinky reason behind it, and they literally just do it for economic and social reasons. Keima travels around with a dog-eared lolly slave, but despite having absolutely no perverse thoughts towards her, everyone thinks he's a disgusting pedo for multiple volumes. This is how the series uses controversial, seemingly indulgent stuff as jokes, polishing the rough edges around them. You take all these trashy cliches that should be self-indulgent and distasteful, and you polish them squeaky clean by inserting them into ridiculous scenarios. They're still there and are repeatedly mentioned, but the aspects that would be considered indulgent aren't there, so it doesn't come off as crass as it should. It's an interesting use of stuff that would usually be pretty niche and alienating. As someone who has consumed a lot of fanservice heavy shows when I was a teen, I still do. It's really interesting to see a lot of those typical cliches reused as bits or amusing plot developments, especially because it's kind of hard to talk about those shows nowadays. As much as I love Tulabru or Ladies vs. Butlers, there's no getting around the fact they literally are just about the tits. That's why the series feels so wholesome and kind of nostalgic. You have these setups that should lead to reader gratification, but instead they just exist as wacky scenarios. Like, it's a series that at first glance I should be reading because I enjoy the fan service it seemingly has, but that fan service is used to make the actual story more amusing and fun. Generic cliches and fetishes seem like they have no purpose if they're not gratifying, right? But the series proves that they can work outside of that. I said earlier, anime has a lineage of very particular specific fetishes existing for a long time. So that means it can be fun to see how they function outside of simply being gratifying. You have these topics that should prevent me from talking about the series in public at all costs, but instead here I am, making a recommendation video. But let's not forget there are two factors to labeling something as very clearly pandering. First is how the story handles that stuff, but the second and most important is whether or not our main character is a self-insert for the audience. And this right here is the X factor. What keeps Lazy Dungeon Master from being nothing but fan service is Keima and the fact that he's not really horny for anything that is not feet. And it sounds hilarious, but it's the truth. You have all these real hot anime girls that are hanging around all the time, and Keima has little to no reaction to them, except for a quick "she's got big boobs" comment here and there. The author literally uses Keima's fetish to create a fan service force field around him. The dude just won't budge unless we're talking about feet, and when he does budge, he only does so for the main girl of the series. The other gets to have his cake and eat it too, use the fan service and the illustrations to sell the series, but then keep the fan service at bay by having both the scenarios and the protagonist not react appropriately at all. Alright, I'm done. This video came about because I wanted to talk about this series, but I couldn't without mentioning all the seemingly over-the-top fan service. So I said, fuck it. I'll just make the whole video about the fan service. Yeah. Check Lazy Dungeon Master out if you're nostalgic for all those trashy early 2010s shows. It's basically that, but adjusted to actually be enjoyable past the fan service. Alright, bye.